There is one detail at the end of Silo Season 3, Episode 7 that I think changes the entire scene. We hear a voice on the radio. The voice identifies itself. Juliette hears it. Walker hears it. And within seconds, Juliette calls off a bombing that could have destroyed Judicial. So why are we still debating who was talking? Because the episode gives us just enough information to believe the transmission came from Kennedy, while also giving us several reasons to question whether that voice should be trusted at all. And that second question is much more interesting, because if the voice was Kennedy, then Lukas and Kennedy may have survived. If it wasn't Kennedy, then someone just managed to stop Juliette from destroying Judicial at exactly the right moment. And that would mean the voice knew what Juliette was planning. Let's go back to the sequence. Juliette's group had been working toward the safeguard pipe. They needed to find its exact location and figure out how to stop it before the system could be used against Silo 18. Lukas and Patrick Kennedy were sent outside towards Silo 17. That mission mattered for two reasons. First, Lukas had already been inside Silo 17. He knew what they were looking for. Second, the trip gave them a way to locate the pipe without immediately exposing Juliette's actual plan. Then the mission went wrong. Lukas and Kennedy were attacked. From Silo 18, the group had every reason to believe they had been killed, or at least incapacitated. And this is where the episode makes a very specific choice. We don't get a clean confirmation of their deaths. Instead, Camille gets information from the voice that Lukas Kyle and Patrick Kennedy have been neutralized. That wording matters. The voice doesn't necessarily say they are dead. Camille interprets it that way. And that interpretation becomes extremely useful. Because once Juliette believes the two men are gone, the plan changes. The group decides to bomb Judicial. The reason is simple. They need another way to deal with the safeguard threat, and destroying the relevant infrastructure becomes the desperate option. The explosives are ready. The countdown begins, and then the radio comes alive. That's the first thing that should bother us. The transmission doesn't arrive randomly. It arrives after Juliette has already committed to the bombing. It arrives after the deaths of Lukas and Kennedy have apparently removed the safer option. And most importantly, it arrives before the bomb goes off. The timing is almost too perfect. Now, the obvious interpretation is that Kennedy survived, and there is a lot of evidence for that. The voice sounds like Kennedy. The closed captions identify the speaker as Kennedy. The character uses the established radio communication system, and the episode had already spent time establishing Walker's radio and the code names that would be used over it. That last detail is especially important. Earlier in the episode, the radio isn't treated like random technology that suddenly appears for the finale. Walker specifically explains how they can use it. Kennedy even has a problem with the code names. That scene would be an extremely strange piece of setup if the radio wasn't going to matter later. Then we get the payoff. A voice comes through. Kennedy's identity is recognized, and Juliette realizes that the people she thought were dead may still be alive. That's enough to stop the bombing. But there is a problem. If Kennedy really survived, why did the voice tell Camille they had been neutralized? One explanation is simple. The voice was wrong, and that is possible. We've already seen that the voice isn't omniscient. It has enormous access to information inside the silo, but it doesn't seem to know everything that is happening in real time. There are surveillance gaps. There are things happening outside its immediate control, and Silo 17 has already demonstrated that the system's knowledge isn't perfect. So perhaps the drones attacked Lukas and Kennedy, the voice assumed they were finished, and Kennedy simply survived. That would explain the contradiction. But there's another possibility. The voice knew exactly what happened, and it lied. That is much more interesting, because the voice has already been manipulating Camille's decisions. It doesn't need to physically control every person in the silo. It only needs to give the right person the right information. If it wanted Juliette to abandon the bombing, a fake transmission would be an incredibly efficient way to do it. Think about what the voice would gain. Juliette stops the explosives. Judicial survive. The safeguard infrastructure remains intact. And Juliette's group reveals that they still don't know exactly where the pipe is. That is a pretty good outcome for whoever is protecting the system. So, could the voice have copied Kennedy? Technically, the show has given us enough information to take that theory seriously. We've already seen advanced surveillance. We've seen technology capable of monitoring people in ways the residents don't understand. We've seen the voice manipulate information. And the show has spent a lot of time establishing that people's perception of reality can be altered. So, voice imitation isn't completely outside the rules of this world. But there is one major problem with this theory. The transmission contains details that would be very difficult to fake convincingly. The speaker doesn't simply say, "We're alive." There is confusion. There is the use of the radio. There is the code identification. There is a reference to where they are. And the voice behaves like someone who has actually just survived the journey. That is a lot of unnecessary detail for a simple deception. If the voice wanted to stop the bombing, it could have transmitted one sentence. It could have claimed Kennedy was alive. Instead, the conversation has the awkwardness of two people who have actually been through something. And that brings us back to Kennedy. I think Kennedy was genuinely speaking, but I don't think that automatically means everything we heard proves Lucas is alive. That distinction matters, because the final transmission gives us stronger evidence for Kennedy than it gives us for Lucas. Kennedy's voice is identified, his identity is recognizable, and the closed captions explicitly attribute the transmission to him. Lucas is different. His survival is suggested. The word "we" strongly points toward another survivor, and viewers have noticed that some of the delivery sounds more like Lucas. But the episode doesn't give us a clean visual confirmation. So the radio gives us two different levels of certainty. Kennedy is the person we can identify. Lucas is the person we infer. And I think the writers deliberately constructed it that way. Because if both men simply walked into Silo 17 at the end of the episode, there wouldn't be much mystery left. The interesting question becomes how they survived. And even more importantly, what they found when they got there. Because that is where the timing of this transmission becomes really suspicious. Kennedy didn't contact Silo 18 the moment they reached safety. The call happened when Juliette was about to destroy Judicial. That means the transmission did two things at once. It told Juliette they were alive, and it changed her decision. That second function is the one I think we should pay more attention to. Because whoever was speaking wasn't just reporting their status. Their message directly affected the plan. And that raises the question the episode leaves hanging. Was the radio call a rescue message? Or was it interference? There is another clue that makes the real Kennedy theory stronger. Look at what Juliette had been told before the transmission. Lucas and Kennedy were gone. The group had already moved on to a backup strategy. The bombing was a response to the loss of the two people who could potentially investigate Silo 17 and locate the safeguard pipe. Then the radio proves that assumption wrong. That means the transmission doesn't need to convince Juliette of anything complicated. It only needs to give her one piece of information. Kennedy is alive. That alone is enough. Juliette doesn't need to debate the voice. She doesn't need to understand the attack. She simply realizes that destroying Judicial may be unnecessary. And she stops the bombing. From a storytelling perspective, that is exactly why Kennedy makes sense. The radio is giving Juliette a reason to choose the less destructive option. But there is still a problem with the voice theory that I don't think we should ignore. If the voice created a fake transmission, it would have to know that Juliette was preparing to bomb Judicial. And this is where the surveillance system becomes important. We learned earlier in the season that the cameras are far more extensive than the residents believed. Juliette even discovers that surveillance equipment had been hidden behind the mirrors. So the idea that the voice knew about the explosives isn't crazy. It could have been monitoring the group. It could have known where Juliette was. It could have watched the preparation. It could have known that the bombing was about to happen. But there is a bigger question. Who actually knew the full plan? Juliette knew. Walker knew. The people directly involved in preparing the explosives knew. The group had been discussing the safeguard problem. Camille had access to information through the voice, and the voice had access to the Silo surveillance network. So there is a clear path for information to reach whoever was behind the transmission. That makes the timing suspicious, but it doesn't prove the transmission was fake. In fact, there is one detail that makes the fake Kennedy theory weaker. The voice had already told Camille that Lucas and Kennedy were neutralized. If the voice knew they had survived, why would it tell Camille that? You could argue that this was deliberate deception. Maybe it wanted Camille to believe they were dead. Maybe it wanted Juliette to make the wrong move. But then the radio transmission creates a strange problem. If the voice wanted to manipulate Juliette, why reveal the survival of Kennedy at the exact moment when Juliette was about to destroy the infrastructure the voice appears to care about? That seems backwards. The fake transmission would have to be part of a much larger plan. And right now, the episode hasn't given us enough evidence to establish that plan. That's where I think some of the fan theories go too far. The idea of the voice imitating Kennedy is possible. The show has established enough technological and surveillance capabilities to make it worth discussing. But possible isn't the same thing as supported. Right now, the evidence on screen favors a real transmission. And there is another clue I think is easy to overlook. The episode title is Radio, not the voice, not the message. Radio. The technology itself has been introduced as a way for the silos to communicate. Walker builds it, the suits carry it, the characters establish codes for it. And then, at the moment when Juliette believes she has lost two of her most important allies, that radio connects her to Silo 17. That is a pretty direct payoff. It would be strange to spend all that time setting up a genuine communication system, only to reveal that the final transmission was completely fabricated. Could the writer still do it? Absolutely. But they would need to give us another layer of evidence in the next episode. For now, I think the simplest explanation is stronger. Kennedy survived. He reached Silo 17. He got access to the radio, and he contacted Silo 18. The bigger mystery is Lukas, because the episode carefully avoids giving us the same level of confirmation. The use of "we" suggests Kennedy wasn't alone, and that matters because Lukas is the one person who has a reason to be in Silo 17. He already knows the place. He knows Solo. He knows the geography. He knows what Juliette discovered there. And more importantly, Lukas is one of the few people capable of connecting the information from Silo 17 back to the problem in Silo 18. If he survived, the mission suddenly has a purpose again. They can search for the safeguard pipe, they can locate it, they can report its position, and Juliette's group can potentially deal with the problem without destroying Judicial. That is exactly why the radio transmission changes the story. The bombing was a dead-end plan. Kennedy's message gives them another route. And if Lukas is alive, that route becomes even more useful. So my current read is this. The person talking on the radio was Kennedy. The evidence for that is stronger than the evidence for an impersonation. The closed captions identify him. The voice matches. The code setup was established earlier. The radio itself was deliberately introduced for communication between the silos. And the message contains the kind of imperfect, spontaneous communication you'd expect from someone who had actually survived the mission. I think Lukas probably survived too, but that part is still an inference. And there is one thing I don't think we can explain yet. The voice said Lukas and Kennedy had been neutralized. Then Kennedy contacted Silo 18 from Silo 17. So either the voice genuinely didn't know they survived, or it knew something about their survival and chose to hide it. That distinction could completely change how we understand the voice. Because if the voice was simply wrong, its reach has limits. If it was lying, then the entire conversation with Camille becomes much more sinister. And if it somehow knew Kennedy would reach Silo 17 and still allowed that radio call to happen, then we have to ask what it actually wanted Juliette to do next. That is the part I'm watching. Because Kennedy's voice may have stopped the bombing, but we still don't know who benefited most from that decision. And that leaves us with one question for episode 8. Did Kennedy call Silo 18 because he wanted Juliette to know they survived, or because someone wanted Juliette to believe they survived?